2011 in an article entitled Migration and Climate Change, an Overview by Etienne Piguet and Antoine Pocut and Paul de Costanier. Climate change has become a major concern for international communities. Among its consequences, its impact on migration is the object of increasing attention from both policymakers and researchers. Yet, knowledge where is my image? Okay. So I'm the speaker. I'm speaking now. Can you just fix this, Mr. Yildiz? That
yes, it's okay.
You're showing me all the time.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Please.
Yeah. Sorry for that. I was saying that climate change has become a major concern for the international community. Among its consequences, its impact on migration is the object of increasing attention from both policymakers and researchers. Yet, knowledge in this field remains limited and fragmented. There are uncertainties surrounding the actual mechanisms at stake, the number of persons affected, and the geographical zones concerned. There are debates between those who stress the direct impact of the environment on population flows and those who rather insist on the social, economic, and political context in which such flows occur. Different disciplines bring in their respective inputs to the literature. Now, there are two major interconnected arguments. The first one is that the weight of environmental and climate factors in migration and their relationship to both push and pull factors, whether of a social, political, or economic nature. Understanding the role of the environment in migration dynamics implies analyzing how and why people are vulnerable to climate change, as well as an examination of the different strategies they develop to cope with or adapt to environmental stress, migration being one among other such strategies. The political framework in which such migration flows should take place and the manner in which to treat the people who move in connection with environmental factors. This implies a discussion of the possible protection to be granted to those in a situation of vulnerability and the responsibilities of states of the international community in providing such protection. The two issues are deeply intertwined, as the extent to which the environment determines migration is intimately connected to the status to be associated with the people concerned. Okay, I will pass this over. The American geographer Ellen Churchill Semple later wrote that the search for better land, milder climate, and easier conditions of living starts a movement of people in which, in view of their purpose, necessarily leads them into an environment sharply contrasted to their original habitat. So people who are subject to migration always find themselves in a weird condition in the places where they move to, and it will take them maybe generations until they adapt to that. The realities of today, that was in 2011, the realities of today would give more complexity to the nexus. Climate change is becoming more imminent and dry seasons are witnessed more often. Economies have been affected from the COVID-19 pandemic in the last 2 years, and the effects of that will remain with us for some years. Turmoil in migrate sending and migrate receiving countries, mainly affecting the nature and scale of migration, like in the Syrian case. 4 million have been forced to migrate out of their country, original country, and in a very short time, and this is very unnatural for the country of Syria, for example. And the floor is open for more as the dimension of the nexus are examined, researched, and comprehended. This webinar is about that. Now, we will have four valued speakers. Camille Dicoz, policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute of Europe, as she will be replacing Dr. Hane Byers, the director of MPIE, who apologized due to a medical condition, and we wish her good health. She will talk about climate and migration nexus. Dr. Caroline Zickgraf, Deputy Director of Hugo Observatory. She will talk about environment, migration, and politics. Merve Suzan Luc Bilben, Actines University. She will talk about climate change-induced migration. And Dr. Isai Dognon, University of Bamako, Mali, will talk about water and migration nexus. So I welcome you all, and I will give the floor to Camille Dicoz to tell us about her experiences in this field.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jaluka, and thank you for this invitation. I don't know if Dorsani would be possible for you to share your screen.
Yeah, Camilla, I will help you right now, just a moment.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I don't think, can people see? Ah, wonderful. Wonderful.
Migration nexus.
Wonderful.
No, it's Camilla.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
When you say, please, I will do it.
Sure. Thank you so much. So my presentation today will be about, the climate migration nexus, one of the many nexus that is often discussed in international circles. And already in 2013, we had efforts of the European Commission to speak about these linkages between migration and development. I'll start with a bit of background, and I think we've already partly covered that, but the issue of climate change first started to feature in the discourse on migration and displacement in the 80s, 90s, along with concepts such as climate migrant, climate refugees. And these terms suggested a new form of mobility had emerged. However, what we've quickly seen is that this terminology came under the critique of researchers for being, for its overly deterministic cause-effect relationship. And so instead of studying climate change in isolation from other drivers contributing to migration and displacement, such as conflict of loss of livelihood, the current state of the research has shifted toward viewing climate change as in the overall context in which migration and displacement occurs, and where several drivers interact with each other to produce movement. And so what we're seeing now, it's like new insights that have emerged on how climate change contribute to different forms of mobility, which type of population tend to be more resilient, and also how humanitarian and development actor can intervene in this context. And in particular, it has become clear that displacement caused by so-called natural disaster is mainly related to extreme weather condition, and most researchers now link, the rise in weather-related disaster to some climate change. So today, I'll cover two main points in my presentation. First, migration drivers and how they relate to climate. And then I'll move to the notion that migration can be a mitigation measure for the effect of climate change and what we meant by that. So if we move to the next slide, I'll briefly delve into, yes, this one. So I'll briefly delve into what we mean by migration drivers, some of the limitation of the data, and some of what we know. So migration drivers, as we know, people migrate for a very complex set of factors. And maybe first a distinction that's quite important is the one between aspiration to migrate, which can be captured in surveys, but other dimensions that are more difficult, which is one's decision to migrate and actual migration, where sometimes we have a bit more difficulties to assess and to research. But altogether, what is important to stress is that these effects are all very context specific and difficult to predict. What we're seeing is progress in the scholarship on the linkages between climate change and migration, but there are still many pending questions on how we can capture these linkages. And many scholars who've been working in this field for years convinced that a lot remains to be done, to be researched, to explore links, for example, between food insecurity, climate, migration. There's a lot that we still don't know. What we know, however, is that, and that numerous empirical studies show it, that there is no direct monocausal connection between environmental climate change and migration. And as I've said before, human mobility is extremely complex, and the impact of environmental climate change on migration is mediated through economic, social, political processes. And also we can think about migration not just as a result of climate change, but also as one of the many food livelihood strategies that households adopt to deal with stresses emerging from environmental changes. Maybe one last word on what I want to stress today. The fact that displaced people rarely move after climate disaster for a long time, but also that displaced people are more likely to migrate through mitigation strategy to long-term change. And on this, if we move to the next slide, I want to emphasize this point on the linkages between natural shocks and their effect on migration. So a key fact is that communities tend to avoid moving after a natural disaster, but that's only if they can. Some previous studies shows that rapid shocks such as flooding, storms, earthquake, they rarely lead to important international migration because communities usually prefer to stay together, especially if they receive enough emergency support. And that's been, illustrated in study conducted in South Asia and East Asia Pacific. And overall conclusion is that migration tends to be internal. And that's, for something I'll come back to, due to lack of resources, sometimes to move abroad, but also due to the lack of legal pathway to do so. However, what we know is this, that still more research is needed in other contexts. And that goes back to a point I made earlier about, that we're still in there, there's still a lot to be researched in this field. Another point that I thought was quite interesting to outline is the fact that people displaced by natural disaster are likely to return home. And they can do so more rapidly than those displaced due to other factors such as conflict. So according to previous research, there are an average of 90% of affected population that return, but there are many factors that shape this decision, be it ownership, the household income, age, education, opportunities, scope of the disaster. and so on. Now, if we move to the next slide, I think what we're seeing in reverse is the linkages between gradual changes that are due to climate change and departure. So I wanted to first give some example of what are some of this gradual change that we're witnesses as a result of climate change, be it prolonged period of extreme heat that has been a phenomenon in Central or Eastern Africa, drought or desertification that can lead to significant loss of arable land annually. And these long-term environmental effect changes impact migration aspiration in the first place, but then also actual departure, especially as repeated shock and all this gradual degradation, they ultimately undermine the efforts to build back that are often talked about after a disaster. And as such, households are likely to organize migration to secure regular streams of resources, particularly in regions with low agricultural productivity. And here we can go back to the critical role of remittances in relation to community resilience, which is a trend that has been very visible during this COVID-19 crisis. These migration decisions are made at household level as part of wider strategy to mitigate change in the environment. And I think what's important to stress here is that that goes a bit against the notion that communities are just passive, that they're subject to climate change, but that they don't have this mechanism in place to cope with these changes. At the same time, what is important to headline is that climate change may also reduce the ability to migrate, especially if they affect livelihood, which means fewer resources and ultimately fewer resources to migrate. And here I could give an example from Tanzania. I mean, we've at MPI published some research from, and I'll post it after this presentation, of some researchers who worked on this context, showing that, not all family will migrate in response to weather shock or declining condition. And that we're seeing, for example, in the context of the research, is that it's the household with medium level of wealth that are more likely to migrate, whereas the high income or the low income household are less likely to do so. And this is because the middle wealth communities are likely to leverage previous earnings to invest in migration and seek higher return through work and send money home. Whereas relatively wealthier household, they're more able to employ alternative livelihood strategy in the face of shocks, even though with the caveat that this may not be durable. And meanwhile, the poorest family often cannot afford the cost of migrating, which is also, should be said, a trend that is not necessarily specific to community facing climate shock, but it's a trend we've seen more broadly about how community with limited resources are unlikely to migrate. And as such, there are really two ways to read migration as a result of climate. Either it's more of a displacement and the result of a failure to adapt, but on the contrary, it can be a successful adaptation. Maybe I'll move to my second point on how migration can be connected. Sorry, if you move to the next slide, how migration can be associated to mitigation strategy to climate change. And I'll just outline three main mitigation strategy to migration when it comes to climate change, related to internal mobility, accelerated urbanization, and international migration. And here, I mean, what we've seen, and that goes back to the point I just made before, there's been this sense that internal mobility is one of the main strategies to adapt to climate change, especially moving to the next city. And we're seeing in a number of contexts, and I'm sure we'll go back to that, on the onset of a drought, some family could send one of their members to work in the city, and then the urban workers send back some money to the family to compensate for crop failure that year or the next year. And in this case, migration is a way to be, is employed to manage the crisis situation. So if we move to the next slide, I'd like to say a few words about migration strategy, and link it with internal mobility. What we've seen from the data that's available, it's like people displaced by natural disaster are most likely to move internally. Internal migration is a long-standing coping mechanism. And here we've data, from Africa, and I'm sure Professor Dunion will go back to that, with this idea is that in the result of climate change, people tend to move to short distances, but that we're also seeing that mitigating this, the factor of climate change could already result in limiting some of this flow. Now, I think what we're seeing also is that all of it is very context specific, and I'll put also the link in the chat box after this conversation. Study conducted in different contexts have shown a preference for internal mobility, but that's not always the case. But for example, there's been research done in several Asian countries showing that decline in agricultural productivity and fewer green space resulted in higher likelihood to moving internally, which lead me to my next slide on the linkages with urbanization, because what we're seeing is people are more likely to move to the nearby city where they can afford to live. But that can be a result of climate change, but many other factors. And often that's also where they are opportunity to work or where they may have relatives and support network. All this, however, result in pressure on services and the environment. And I think this also connects to this concept of urban resilience that tend to focus on urban resilience, climate resilience, but also connect to other dimensions such as conflict, social cohesion, economic participation in different cities, and really is the ability of these urban centers to respond to a variety of changes from food insecurity, limited access to services, and so the idea with this is that. And that's really to inform the work of development actor is to support cities, including secondary cities, peri-urban areas, in mitigating like this new pressure. Having said that, it should also be said that sudden displacement, especially to city, can create new shock, and this is also areas with high population density that can be more exposed to floods or mudslides, and also then more vulnerable to some changes related to climate change. And so maybe I'll conclude with a final point that I think I'll begin to discuss, which is a link between migration and international migration, and that's my last slide. Because this, I've talked a lot about internal migration, and a lot of the data that exists show that there's limited evidence of like between climate change and international migration, and especially something that I think has been covered extensively in the media is the risk that there is that mass migration come from Africa or the Middle East to Europe. And I think Caroline will go back to that, but that's something that is not evidenced by current research, because again, only those resources are likely to do this long international journey. Having said that, this is again very context specific. And to go back to what we're seeing in Central America at the moment, for example, there's been a number of evidence that in the countries affected by the hurricanes at the end of last year, in Guatemala, for example, people have been able to move and have tried to move to the US as a result of this climate event, but also connected to a number of other factors that are to do, with a new administration in the United States, presence of diaspora network in the US, but also access to microfinance that sometimes have also helped to fund some of these journeys. So with that, I'll conclude here and over to the next panelist.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Camille, because you did an excellent work. You also stuck to the time given. Now we can have the second speaker. So we will have the questions and answers in the meantime after the third or fourth session. Caroline Ziggraf, Deputy Director of the Hugo Observatory, she will talk about environment, migration, and politics. So please have the floor.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully
yes,
you'll
please.
be able to see that. Can you see it?
It's okay, Caroline.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to follow up Camille as well. I think there's some nice overlap between our presentations. And basically what I wanted to do today was just go over some of these myths. I have some background noise. Is that just me?
Please, all the attendants, can you just mute your mics, please? So just leave the speaker to take the floor. Thank you.
Thanks so much. But yeah, I want to go over, and Camille referenced this a bit, but some of the gaps that we have between what we know empirically, scientifically about the links between climate change and migration and displacement as well, versus this kind of common misperceptions, stereotypes about the climate refugee, for example, and the links between climate change and migration. So I will just go over kind of some of the big questions and the big answers that we're seeing. But before I do that, I want to kind of give you a little bit of warning about how I speak and the words that I use. So language around climate change and migration is actually quite controversial. And whether you say climate refugees or you say climate migrants or environmental migration, all has very different connotations. And so just as a preface for me, what I like to say is human mobility is the kind of umbrella term that I use. Conveniently, it relates to environment. So I make this nice graphic just to show you that human mobility covers a range of things, and that can be migration and that can be displacement. So there's not an either or. I don't like to frame these as binaries that we either talk about climate migration or we talk about disaster displacement, because all of this is kind of shades of gray. And that's the same thing where it comes for time, how long people move, temporary or permanent. I like to say permanent migration is only permanent when you die. Like, who knows, right? So also in space, that everything is this kind of sliding scale from very short distances that people move, even within their own cities, which we don't usually qualify as migration, to long distances. And that's not always the same as geopolitical distance. So for example, I work a lot in Senegal, and Senegalese fishers move 9 kilometers and they cross into Mauritania. So it's a very short distance, but also international. So just starting from that perspective that everything is a little bit gray, everything's a spectrum. And then of course, these are affected by both sudden shocks, things like natural onset or sudden onset disasters, floods, which is the #1 cause of displacement for people, and slow onset changes. And a lot of times these things are happening in the same places. So again, working mostly on coastal areas, I work a lot on coastal erosion and sea level rise, but I can't also disregard flooding, right? These happen together. Soil salinization, flooding, drought, sometimes all happen in the same places. So while migration is complex, so are these environmental changes. Now the first part, and I think that Camille covered this quite well, but I want to just reiterate this, is that this myth around the climate migrant or the climate refugee. Now, I don't have a problem saying climate migrant, as long as we understand that it's never just climate change. Again, climate change, just like any social phenomenon that climate change affects, it never acts alone. So it doesn't just come into some sort of vacuum and climate change now causes migration or now causes displacement. It affects all of those other drivers that Camille mentioned. It is a threat multiplier for many things, including conflict, and it often deepens rather than creates vulnerabilities or inequalities. And then climate migration is not, again, something new, especially if we think about environment as the broad category. This idea that climate migration is something that we've just discovered or is just now happening, or this idea that it will happen, that it hasn't happened yet, that it's something for 2050, is false. So environmental migration is the first type of migration. So if we think about the initial reasons that humans moved in the beginning of civilization, that was hunter-gatherers. We were always chasing better environmental conditions. So climate change is kind of a new, maybe set of environmental circumstances, but environmental migration is not new. It's much older than economic migration, right? So just to, again, put ourselves more in the idea of normalizing migration as a response to environmental change. And again, it affects all other migration drivers. So the way I always talk about this, and I think is easy, is I tell people speed. It always affects social, political, economic, and environmental and demographic drivers. Climate change affects all of those, not just one. They all act in combination. And it depends on the context, again, where we are, what that combination looks like, and when does environment become more important as a driver than in the past? Or when does climate change that constellation and create new dynamics of migration? Or decrease migration as well. So with climate change, specifically, what are the impacts we're most concerned about with human mobility? Certainly sea level rise. Sea level rise is important because obviously, again, this is the hydropolitics community. I think I don't need to tell you how important water is, but the fact that most people live near a coastline, climate change doesn't happen evenly, but it doesn't affect populations evenly either. So when you think about these coastal cities like Lagos or like Dakar or Dhaka or any of these places that are near coastlines, the number of people that are potentially at risk of either displacement or who may be obliged to migrate in some way is enormous. And of course, then the added layer that we have places that more than 1.5 degrees global warming means they don't exist anymore. We have certain, small island states that 2 degrees, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement with endeavors to strive for 1.5, 2 degrees already means there are countries that no longer exist. And the geopolitical questions that brings. What does that mean when a country no longer has a physical territory? Of course, temperature increase. We know that there are places in the world that at least physically will become uninhabitable. In the Middle East, for example. Climate variability. This is one that often I think people don't talk about as much as sea level rise or extreme events, but the unpredictability of weather patterns. So when you're in farming, for example, and you have to plant your crops at a certain time, when those seasons aren't predictable anymore, when you don't know if it's going to rain tomorrow or if it'll, should I plant tomorrow, should I harvest tomorrow, that unpredictability also affects migration and also affects where people can sustain livelihoods and where they might have to move to. And again, extreme events. So this being kind of the sudden onset disaster displacement. So last year alone, since 2008, we've seen about 318 million internal displacements because of disasters, which is a huge number, much more than conflict. And last year alone, we saw 30.7 million people who were displaced by disasters. So the disasters are reflected in the blue versus what you'll see is the conflict reflected in the orange. And 30 million of that 30.7 million were weather-related disasters. Now, why does this matter? Because geophysical, while also important, aren't directly related to climate change. So again, this idea that this is something for the future is false. This idea of future scenarios we need to be looking at right now, what's happening. Now, the other thing being that these numbers, so if I tell you 30.7 million people were internally displaced last year, that doesn't capture a huge amount of variables. It doesn't capture most slow onset changes. So it doesn't capture coastal erosion. It doesn't capture people moving because of sea level rise or soil salinization or lack of potable water. It doesn't capture cross-border displacement, so the people moving across international borders to neighboring countries. It doesn't capture voluntary, relatively voluntary migration. It only captures this kind of sudden onset disaster displacement. So I think it's important to know that even when we have these numbers, it doesn't mean that we should take them as all encompassing. And we can imagine that there actually may be many more people on the move than what this can capture. However, with numbers, the other misconception or myth that I would like us to move away from is this, again, this focus on future billions of climate refugees. It's not scientifically based. So if you see these reports of that 1.2 billion climate refugees was a number that came out last year. It's not based in science. It's not based in empirical reality. It tends to be kind of fear-based numbers to kind of scare people into climate action. And again, this nexus is much more complex and non-linear than any single number or projection could capture. And actually what it can do is do a disservice to the reality of climate change and migration. It's often based on really deterministic assumptions. It assumes everybody who's affected, living in a place that's affected by climate change will move, which is not true. And that they're all equally vulnerable, which we know that that's not true. The other thing is that we do know is that the poorest and the most marginalized will suffer the greatest consequences. And Camille also stepped on this. This is my personal field of research that I tend to explore is immobility. So again, one of the biggest non-linearities in this relationship is that it's not just that as the scale of climate impacts increase, that migration increases. Again, no, it doesn't work like that. Sometimes as the scale of migration increases, or in climate change increases, in fact, migration can decrease because climate change removes those resources necessary to migrate. So it may be traditionally you did move across borders, or you did engage in seasonal migration, but now you don't have the resources to do that. Again, migration takes not just money, it takes social networks, it takes skills, languages, etc. So it can be that people are increasingly trapped. Now, and that speaks to, again, this myth that goes alongside the billions of climate refugees is this myth that Europe is going to be invaded by climate refugees. All of these billions of migrants are coming to Europe, right? Apparently it's the only place that's an option, but this is false, right? This is empirically, we know that that's not what's happening. We know that most people, yes, are moving within their own countries. And that's not just because of a lack of resources. That's also because people like to stay within their own countries. So it's not also just because we can't move to Europe. It's also because we don't want to, right? So if you look at West Africa is the most mobile region in the world. So most mobility within West Africa is not to Europe, it is within West Africa. And so that is a pattern that climate change is not changing. People still want to remain within their countries, if not within their countries, within neighboring countries, moving to neighboring countries. And so again, if we don't understand that, we're not creating policies that are actually scientifically based. Also, people move into risk zones. So it's not always a story of people moving from one dangerous place to a safe place. We see, because it's multi-causal, people are often moving into areas that are floodplains, located in flood risk zones, for example, because again, those are the places that maybe that's where economic opportunities are in the cities, for example. So again, just to beware of this climate refugee story. The idea that promoting climate action requires making migration scary is not necessary. And in fact, it's actually dangerous. So climate action, because we hear that 1.2 billion people are going to be on the move, it doesn't increase climate action. What it does is it increases restrictive migration policies. It creates more fear of the other, and that's, again, not based on empirical realities. So it actually makes the migrant a pawn in a very dangerous game and results in fewer protection mechanisms for people, more dehumanization, and more restrictive policies. And just kind of the last point I just wanted to touch on, because I gave you those slides on conflict, displacement versus disasters. I just want to also note that, again, this is a tricky relationship here, but separating conflict and climate does not always make sense. In many places, these things are interlinked when it comes to migration and displacement. Sometimes they're at odds, but when competition over resources drives displacement, or when displacement puts pressure on resources, we can see that that relationship also has an impact on conflict and conflict on climate change. So again, we have to not separate these or try to hierarchize what kind of migration is more important, but rather see how they're intertwined and how we can create holistic solutions. So with that, I will just say that the last goal really for me is, politically speaking, to take all of these myths and look at those realities and then have an agreed point, which is that we should be averting displacement whenever possible, minimizing the number of people who are forced to move, and that may mean facilitating migration as adaptation, as an adaptation strategy. And addressing the migration that's already taking place. Again, avoiding this idea that this is something for 2050, but rather looking at what's happening right now. So I thank you very much. With that, I cede the floor.
Thank you, Caroline. I think if it was for me, I would ask you to come and have a whole seminar for yourself, because you have been speaking comprehensively, and the whole issue. The effect of climate change cannot be simplified as if A, then B. It could be vice versa sometimes, that even if climate change worsens the situation in terms of agriculture, in terms of land availability, in terms of resource availability like fishing and other things. But also there is a pull factor, that countries with better living conditions, better job opportunities, also maybe inducing populations from other places to come and try to settle in these places, or at least work there and come back with remittances. This is a very important thing. Shall we move to the next speaker? Merve Hanım. Where is Merve?
Hi, sure.
Hi, you're here.
Yeah, I'm here. I thought I will go first. Okay.
Okay, we are welcoming Merve Suzan Ilik Bilben, and she will be talking on understanding climate change induced migration. Is that right?
Yeah, that's
okay.
Right.
So you're welcome. What are these cats or things?
Okay. It's my cat, Arya.
Okay, okay.
Okay, can you see my slide?
Yes, it's clear, very clear, Merve.
Would you remain within the 20 minutes? Should I?
Sure, hopefully.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jaluka. First of all, I should start by thanking the organizers of this event, especially to Dursun Yıldız for his kind invitation. I'm so happy to be here as the youngest one, especially as a PhD candidate. After these quite informative presentations, I'm also going to examine the relationship between climate change and migration by including experiences and projections. As we all know, people have always migrated in response to environmental change, and the movement is a traditional part of human life that allows people to escape from a threat or increase the resilience, especially when planned. So we can say that the new side of movements triggered by climate change is the underlying anthropogenic basis, the susceptible approach of many people to it, and the relative rapidity of climate change. The decision to migrate or not is mostly shaped by the demographic and socioeconomic characteristic of the individual or the household, as well as the facilitating and hindering factors that determine whether the movement is possible or not. Therefore, it's not easy to distinguish the factors specific to climate change, as said before. Factors such as lack of resources, population pressure, conflicts, ethnic relations, and economic models or gender roles display a complex relationship in it. The effect of climate change on human mobility appears to be very diverse, whether this is voluntary, compulsory, domestic, or international. It can displace a wealthy family on the coast of South Carolina and a poor family whose lands have become uninhabitable on the coast of in Niger. I mean, these effects are also intertwined with different socioeconomic problems where they occur. This makes it difficult to predict and understand the type and speed and the extent of the human mobility. There are quite different projections about migrations caused by climate change. If climate mobility was a purely political process, it would be impossible to predict the number of people who will move. However, predictions on this issue are shaped by current and future effects. On the other hand, the multidimensional structure of the effects, that is, their intertwining with other social, political, and economic transformations, makes it difficult to predict or provide a clear projection. In this sense, the closest way to understand what awaits us regarding the future climate mobilities is to understand the current movements. The role that climate change plays in driving disaster displacement is also often seen as a direct one, but the evidence doesn't support this hypothesis. Climate change has been proven to make certain hazards in some regions more frequent and intense. Extreme weather events such as floods, storms, and drought account for more than 89% of all disaster displacement. It's certainly plausible that the climate is driving increased displacement, but it hasn't been convincingly quantified yet. There's broad agreement among scientists that climate change in combination with other factors is likely to increase future displacement. Research showed that even if the world's population were to remain at its current level, the risk of flood-related displacement would increase by more than 50% with each degree of global warming. So it is important to note that not only all these models have high levels of uncertainty, but they're also likely to produce underestimates. Disaster displacement is the result of a complex process with many drivers. A multitude of demographic, political, and socioeconomic factors determine whether people can withstand the impacts of a hazard or are forced to leave their homes. Climate change interacts with all of them, not necessarily triggering the displacement directly, but as an additional stressor when natural and social resources and capacities of humans and systems are already stretched. So, as you can see, we can summarize the link between the effects of climate change and migration movements under two main headings. While a longer time frame is required to determine whether an event is attributable to climate change, the current sequence of events is in line with the IPCC projections, which argue that more frequent and intense extreme weather events will occur due to the global warming. As we can see, the climate change not only complicates humanitarian emergencies due to the drought in Africa, but also causes serious consequences of increased frequency and intensity of weather events. Floods don't affect large geographical areas such as droughts, but on the contrary, they affect certain areas and are sudden disasters that damage buildings, agricultural lands, and infrastructure. Therefore, migration occurs suddenly affecting both urban and rural areas because of the unpredictability of the number of people who had to move suddenly as a result of floods and the inability to make plans. It's seen that both the camps are insufficient and those who settle in the camps continue to stay in the camps much longer than expected. The role of climate change in increasing the frequency and intensity of storms and hurricanes is more obvious relatively compared to floods. As you can see, extreme weather events with increasing intensity and frequency have displaced hundreds of thousands of people in the world, especially in Asia-Pacific region and the Caribbean basin in the last decade. It's possible to say that the effects of sudden weather events such as hurricanes and storms on migration movements are similar. It's seen that the evacuation areas are extremely insufficient and the disadvantaged groups are left behind, both in terms of evacuation and resettlement. Studies show that although most of the displacements are carried out in the form of preventive displacement, adequate planning is not done for the predictions that the frequency and the severity of the weather events will increase due to the climate change. The destruction of livelihoods due to the destruction of agricultural areas cause temporary migrations in the form of evacuation to turn into permanent migrations. For this reason, migration from regions from rural population is more common. Although the small island states attract the attention of media in terms of making the voices of people displaced due to the climate change heard, many vulnerable regions with a much higher population density have a serious migration potential due to the rising sea levels. For this reason, migrations due to this long-term and gradual impact of climate change should be through strategies that will reduce existing vulnerabilities and increase resilience. Although quite different solutions have been thought, from building a wall to building a floating island, it has seen that a planned migration will be the most beneficial due to the rising sea levels. In this context, it offers a unique opportunity to plan, develop and implement migration strategies and lead the formation of regional, national and international laws and policies. As we know, due to the rising sea level, salt water seeps into fresh aquifers, increasing the pressure on already limited water and food resources. Precisely for this reason, a projection of how much of the land will be flooded and how many years in how many years doesn't mean much, because life will become unsustainable long before then. There isn't a direct relationship between climate change and wildfire, of course, but researchers have found strong correlations between warm summer temperatures and large fire years. So there's a general consensus that the wildfire cases will increase with the climate change. In Australia, fires burned around 17 million hectares of land and destroyed more than 1,100 homes last year, which were fueled by prolonged drought, extreme heat, and strong winds. Wildfires have triggered around 3.3 million displacements globally since 2008, and almost 90% have taken place in the Americas region. The steadily increasing number of cases is a serious concern. They triggered 1.2 million new displacement globally in the last year, more than 1 million of them in the US, and this is the highest figure on the record for the country. Actually, drought and desertification affect much wider areas than sudden weather events, but the slow and the gradual realization of the effects causes these groups to remain in the background. Most of the time, they aren't even associated with climate change. In this case, it's possible to say that migration took place within the country and in short distances because drought creates serious pressures on the resources needed for long distance migration. Migration due to the declining agricultural productivity and livelihood difficulties is usually the last option. Therefore, in the meantime, the resources of the household are gradually decreasing and they are becoming more vulnerable. Many even turn into communities that are too fragile to migrate. Therefore, it's not possible to say that climate change is always a driving factor for migration. Also, studies in the South American continent seem to follow a different line from the aforementioned findings. Existing international migration networks cause displacement due to the climate change to move out of the country rather than internal migration. It's possible to attribute the fact that individuals are seeing international migration as the only way to overcome vulnerabilities to the prevalence of international migration networks. When we examine the existing empirical studies, we can see that the forms and the patterns of migration due to the effects of climate change mostly occur within the country, often meet in some common points, such as their orientation from rural to urban. But there are also cases that are not suitable for generalization, of course. As we know, climate change increases the risk of floods due to the sudden and heavy rains. It's seen that individuals migrate after floods because rural inhabitants lost their livelihoods, such as fishing and farming, and these migrations are mostly short distances. Migrants tend to move to urban areas in search for employment. For this reason, it has a function to increase move to urban rural to urban migration. The practice of one of the household migrating to finance the rest is also seen here. Adaptation studies for the maintenance of agricultural activities are very important in order to food safety. On the other hand, some data show that migration increases existing inequalities, not adaptation to climate change. This tells us that the debate on migration caused by climate change is supposed to move away from the dichotomy that is either a type of adaptation or a result of non-adaptation, and leads to conclusion that the issue should be examined more deeply based on different cases. One of the reasons why it's thought that the discourse of climate refugee harms individuals displaced due to the effects of climate change is the current dominant language, which causes them to be associated with a kind of apocalyptic picture. This approach, if this is a climate crisis, distracts us from the main focus by causing us turn our attention not to perpetrators of this crisis, but to these victims, namely climate refugees. The words disaster, threat, and emergency are frequently used about climate refugees, and refugees are described as human tsunami or here comes the flood. We also see that potential climate refugees are the recreating primitive lifestyles and the colonial stereotypes as racialized and passive and helpless victims. Moreover, climate refugees are portrayed not only as racialized others in need of protection, but also the potential to bring about a disastrous future. As a result of the ongoing criticisms, we see that understanding of climate migration, which emphasizes migration as a climate change adaptation strategy and doesn't accept the failure of mitigation adaptation policies, has developed in parallel with the discourse. Climate migration, which is presented as a solution to climate change, is seen a viable strategy as long as it's manageable in this context. The word migrant is used partly to avoid the term refugee, as it has a broader connotation, as it also encompasses various environmental migration movements, such as cyclical and seasonal migration, long-term migration due to slow onset changes, or short-term displacement due to sudden events. As a result, we see that the debates in the conceptual field have evolved from millions of climate refugees to the point where migration is grounded and encouraged as a possible and even legitimate adaptation strategy to climate change. This approach, however, raises great doubts that it offers a fairer solution than the other, even if it appears to be more suited in climate action. In IPCC reports, we see that a great deal of space has begun to be devoted to adaptation studies. While mitigation policies provide more benefits at the global level, adaptation is generally effective at the regional but more local level. In the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, it is emphasized that migration can be an effective adaptation strategy against both extreme events and slow onset climate change effects. The Cancun adaptation framework also adopts a language that shows mobility as an integral part of adaptation to climate change. Accordingly, through national adaptation plans, countries should be assessed how climate change will affect human mobility so that individuals, families, and communities are able to stay in their original settlements for as long as possible, if in full compliance with their rights and prevent conditions that could lead to their displacement. But there are also question marks about the extent to which migration methods as an adaptation will improve the conditions of households or individuals, because this field is a newly emerging one, and that is open to interdisciplinary studies, where not enough studies have been done yet. Studies that include many different structural and socioeconomic factors are needed to understand whether this strategy will improve the conditions of households or simply allow them to survive or be trapped. In this context, we see that the migration as adaptation approach, which has been discussed for years, has gained popularity in recent years, has been critically evaluated by scientists in terms of its potential negative effects. These are in context of neoliberalism or neocolonialism, or the extent to which existing organizations or policy mechanisms can work for migration as adaptation or not. One of the notable criticisms is about climate justice, because the narrative of climate refugee, which is extremely problematic, at least guided the claims for justice and gave the opportunity to identify the concrete claims and responsibilities. When we read this in conjunction with the mantra of resilience gaining increasing popularity in climate policy and politics, it looks like that the new narrative of migration as adaptation displays claims of justice and natural rights in favor of an apolitical idea of adaptation based on ability of individual migrants to compete for benefits in labor markets. Removing structural inequalities in order to understand the climate migration link may actually result in narrowing the condition to raise the question of climate justice. Because in this way, the responsibility for adaptation now rests on the households and individuals, and thus climate justice issues and unequal levels of vulnerability being ignored. As can be seen, as a concluding remark, climate mobility is an issue that has the potential to generate new waves of thinking about forced migration, international protection regimes, and debates on social justice and culture of living together. The concept of climate refugee seems to be problematic, while the approach to migration as adaptation has a very high potential to evolve into a dangerous point. Institutional roles and responsibilities at the national and international level, as well as international legal frameworks on climate mobility, remain weak. It shouldn't be forgotten that it is the product of environmental, social, and economic structures that also prepare the ground for anthropogenic climate change. Since the climate change is not a neutral or apolitical phenomenon, unlike tsunami or earthquakes, is largely a product of world economic development. The global community is responsible for climate migrants or refugees indeed. Therefore, it's clear that an ethical search without questioning the historical heritage can contribute to the solution. Policies that focus on the climate change and migration nexus must be accompanied by policies that address the context that make people vulnerable. I think that instead of seeing climate mobility as a potential threat to Western borders, we should focus on global, equitable, and sustainable solutions, because the debates are no longer about whether migrations will occur due to climate change, but how much of these migrations can be realized within the scope of the mitigation and adaptation strategies created by the international community. In this context, the extent of climate mobility and future projections are very important in terms of explaining the importance of taking action today. Thank you very much for attention. That's all.
You are most welcome. Merve, also you surprised me. It's a very good presentation. Thank you very much for that.
Sure.
And it rings up many bells in my head, and probably in the heads of everybody who is present here, that migration from one country to another or within the country is not simply related to one factor, and even if that factor is climate change. Because rich countries, for instance, can react or adapt to climate change by certain measures, which are or certain tools which are available to them. I can give an example from the Netherlands, for instance, in anticipation of climate change causing rise of the water levels. Some people started thinking of floating houses as a kind of solution to that, and it is possible for them to do that, but the scale of it it cannot be that wide, in my opinion. Now, before we go to the last and not least speaker, Mr. Isai Dognon, I can have one question to a selected speaker, one of the three speakers we had so far. Do we have anybody who wants to clarify a point or ask a very to-the-point question? Who? Nobody. Okay, shall we move now to the fourth speaker, Mr. Isai Dognon. The floor is yours, sir. Mr. Dognon? Okay. What's happened?
Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes. Put it on full screen, please.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, that's it. Isai.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Kamal, and for giving me the floor. And I would like, as my predecessor, I would like, first of all, to thank all of you for coming, to thank Dr. Duzin Hedis, I pronounced it good, coordinator of the Hydropolitics Academy, for inviting me to give virtually this talk. So to introduce myself briefly, I'm Isai Douillon, I'm a social anthropologist and assistant professor of French and Humanitarian Studies at Fordham University. But before coming to
Dr. Isai, can you just put the mic at a distance from your mouth? Because it's making additional noise.
Okay. So I start introducing myself. It is clear now, or there's still noises?
Now it's okay, Isai.
Okay.
Yes, please.
So I'm currently at Fordham, but I was saying that before going to Fordham in New York, I've been teaching in Mali, Bamako, for at least 25 years. My talk today will be focusing on farmers' adaptation strategies in the context of water scarcity in the West African Sahel. One of these adaptation strategies is migration, as my colleagues, my co-panelists already mentioned. So within the time given, I would like to focus on the relationship between water and migration in the Sahel region. The EU estimate that 2.1 million people have been displaced from their homes in Mali because of climate-related insecurity. So, where is the Sahel? You may be wondering where and what is the Sahel? The Sahel is a semi-arid band that goes across northern Africa, just south of the Sahara Desert. It is particularly affected by desertification. We are focusing on the western part of the Sahel, and for now, the country of Mali, where I have been doing research on various topics for 20 years, and where I led a project in partnership with UNESCO on the anthropology of water, which has aimed to advance the integration of social, ecological, and hydrological research through a systemic approach to understand the link between water and migration. Given the movements of Sahelian population in search of areas with heavy rainfall or irrigation, our water and migration project goes beyond approach focused on physical and chemical aspects of water to develop a constructive perspective valuing local responses to climate change and water management. Giving value to cultural practices related to water and migration requires a particular attention to experiences, to knowledge, and to conversation with women and men who live by and with water. For the last 30 years, the availability of water has shaped the migratory process within the African continent. Native and migrant populations interact over water resources, whose scarcity has also led to conflict, often between agricultural and pastoral populations. The analysis of ecological displacement and migration is of capital importance in understanding the interactions between societies and methods of natural resource management in rural localities of Sahelian Africa and other developing countries. So as anthropologists, we look carefully at the cultural dimension of water. You might be familiar with ecology, which we can think about as the science of organism relationships with their environment and their existing conditions. Anthropological ecology, then, is the science of relations of a given society establishes with its environment. It studies the ways people organize this environment for their survival and of future generations. And here, water is a key element. Already in the 1940s, in West Saharan Africa, water was an important theme in anthropological writings, such as this book, The God of Water, written by renowned French anthropologist Marcel Griot. Mali is a country of riparian societies, has 75% of its populations live alongside the rivers. They developed rich practices and oral traditions around water from generation to generation. Recently, to promote the cultural dimension of water, UNESCO has created a global network of water anthropology for local action. NETWA is a global network dedicated to collect resources related to water, including water engineering and policy in order to reach the Millennium Development Goals. It promotes the International Hydrological Program's paradigm shift toward the integration of the cultural dimension of water. It is designed to encourage interaction between anthropologists working on water issues and water professionals such as hydrologists, geologists, engineers, policymakers. So the link between water and migration in the Sahel has a long history, as testified the oral traditions. So this link is not new, as we know from the African oral traditions. As a historical source, oral tradition reminds us of the migration of several ethnic groups and the disappearance of ancient cities caused by climate disasters such as drought, famine, flooding, combined with other factors such as war and external invasions. As drought hit the Sahel in the 1970s and 1980s, we also now see the measurable objective links between water scarcity and migration in contemporary times. Recent discussions On climate change in the Sahel distinguish between displacement caused by so-called rapid onset events, for example, famine, flood blockage, short rainfall, and migration taking place in the context of so-called slow onset events, such as desertification, drought, land degradation, or water scarcity, and a corresponding distinction between environmentally induced migration on the one hand and environmental induced displacement on the other hand. So, I mean, it was, I forget who said that, but all my co-panelists already said this point, raised this point. These distinctions highlight the need to differentiate between different ways in which environmental factors can impact on migrations. As said earlier, in our research, migration is conceptualized as an active adaptation strategy. However, as all changes in social environment of individuals, environmental change affects individuals and groups in different ways. In 1987, André Marty, an anthropologist and development worker working in Mali, identified 5 social categories who had been differently affected by drought and famine in Timbuktu region. In 2004, I carried out a project aiming to understand their different adaptation strategies according to their ability to migrate internally, externally, regionally, or not at all. So these five affective social categories are: the first, malnourished, people suffering from extreme food insecurity; and second, floating communities without any property rights in their region; and third, impoverished, unstabilized communities, mostly from nomadic pastoralists; fourth, impoverished, relatively stabilized community, mostly sedentary communities with access to land, water; and fifth, less impoverished, relatively stabilized communities, rural families with some wealth, access to land, and access to opportunity through connection to politics, remittances, and commerce. What I did was to highlight the cause and effect relations between the severe drought impact on the livelihoods of these groups and their migratory models. My research shows that the migrants who take over small jobs in larger Malian towns, such as Mopti, Uchala, Bamako, and so on, are from the first group. They usually say we flee hunger. Those who migrate for more than 1 year to neighboring countries, such as Ghana, Ivory Coast, Senegal, often belong to the third group. However, the seasonal migrants who move from one town to another within Mali or in neighboring countries belong to the 4th and 5th groups. Floating communities are mainly former slaves without land and livestock, and since 2096 into this group have entered people who lost their farms as a result of land disputes. They later leave their village in search of piece of land for cultivation for another place where they will settle definitely or temporarily. In addition, regarding international migration, there is the destination differences between farmers and nomadic stock breeders. The first headed for Ghana, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and southern city of Mali. On the other end, the latter migrated toward Libya, Saudi Arabia, and Algeria. It was said that the offspring of this third generation of migrants came to Mali after the fall of Libya and wage the war in the northern part of Mali. It is important to understand the differences between these groups, their differential access to resources, and their different practices of migration. So to see that the link between droughts and migration also depends on social status, history, and access to land. So now I'm moving to discuss about the climate change and policy responses. And I'm taking the region I have done most of my research in Timbuktu region. If we debate the link between water scarcity, food insecurity, and migration in Africa, we come face to face with the policy responses as adaptation measure designed by external donors on the advantage of farmers and stock breeders. In the Sahel, particularly in Mali, policy responses following this perspective often focus on preventing migration, stabilizing communities by developing irrigation programs and securing water resources. My recent research, however, has highlighted that these programs became drivers of migration when their cost is too high for rural communities. Let me briefly present two types of irrigation implemented in Mali as a solution to drought and food insecurity. The first is a small-scale irrigation in droughts and famine-driven area in the north, founded by development aid. And the second is the Office du Niger, a state-run irrigation project in the good rainfall south. In the north, since mid-1980s, many agro-pastoral projects have been initiated by Malian state. Norwegian Church Aid, the Association of Cooperation for Research and Development Accord, Handicap International, and Islamic Relief, all to cope with ecological disaster and resettle displaced communities on their land. And since 2000, German agency, GTZ, has founded vast small-scale irrigation program in the 5 districts of Timbuktu. The slogan of this aid program was, "It is better to stay home and farm irrigated perimeters than migrate." Yet, 4 decades of development programs to mitigate climate change effects have not changed anything in migration waves. On the contrary, the destinations have multiplied, and the majority of candidates are young men and boys under age 20. Of course, Sahelian farmers would welcome improved technology, but they need one which is adapted to the climatic, economic, and social context. The irrigation programs developed by these projects rely on motor pumps engines, consuming lots of gas and requiring costly spare parts. The farmers' dependence on imported technology in landlocked countries like Mali, and especially in a remote area like the northern region, is one of the main obstacles to mitigating the climate effect that would reduce population migration in and out of Mali. As a result, in addition to the ecological causes of migration, there are now technologically induced causes such as the introduction of irrigated systems that led farmers to become indebted. To pay back this debt or get their own means of farming, they had to migrate elsewhere. Let me talk about now the case of Office du Niger. As many of you may know, Mali is crossed by 2 rivers and their tributaries, Niger River and Senegal River. The Niger River is the 3rd largest river in Africa after the Nile and the Congo. The inner delta of Niger makes 25,000 square miles suitable for irrigation. And this is where the Office du Niger, or ON, is located. The ON was conceived and established by French colonial government in 1932 as the largest irrigated agricultural body in Francophone Africa. It was created with a view to developing the French cotton industry, as well as becoming the granary of West Africa. It also had a social objective to becoming a pilot region for the modernization of African farming. Regarding to migration to Office du Niger, I would say there are two historical periods of farmers' migration to the Office du Niger. The first was when farmers from the different regions of French West Africa had been brought forcibly to cultivate cotton. And the second group came after Mali's independence in 1960, and particularly after the first and second droughts. This last group of free farmers came from across the country in search of irrigated lands. The ON grants farmers renewable tendencies. Since 1982, the Office Niger has been the subject of major institutional reforms, in particular the transfer to newly established village association of many of the functions, supply of agricultural products, managing agricultural loans, and overseeing the process of rice cultivation to marketing. The administration of the Office in Niger relinquished these responsibilities to focus entirely on water management. From 1994, new committees.
Dr. Isai.
Okay, let me conclude. I have 1 minute.
Okay, you're concluding. Okay, very good.
Okay. So I wanted to give more details on Office Niger, but I can move straight to my conclusion, saying a few words on this part. So what is clear in Office Niger is not a lack of water. Indeed, there are plenty. There are abundance of water, but it has become very expensive. Farmers complain about how much water costs and how difficult it is to access. Indeed, farmers even contest the idea that water is a commodity. I heard farmers wonder, but how is it that the office sells water and I have to buy water from the office? Isn't water given by God? How can anyone own it? I have identified several things that farmers are doing to deal with high water price. So to limit, not to quote all these things, let me conclude and give you takeaways. My first takeaway is the key point is the complex relations between migration and development aid in a region of protracted drought like the Sahel. Because this is in the Sahel, development aid and migration are very related, and it is interesting to see the link between these two systems. Second, in a hostile climate zone, migration is a survival strategy for most impoverished farmers and stock breeders. And third, policy responses should not be aimed at stopping migration. And it is true that since these last 20 years, many of EU aid in the Sahel countries is to stop migration, to saying people don't go anywhere, stay in your place, don't go to Europe. And we have, as anthropologists, I say, we have to see migration as a way people can get extra income to face high cost of irrigated farming, because they need even money to adapt to the agricultural system to the changing climate. So in the north, women are those who really migrate. It's interesting. Just women are those who migrate very rarely. They are involved steadily in economic activities as far as men's migration do not give them any alternative. They farm their own rice plots and vegetable gardens. And fifth, in the context of water scarcity, food insecurity, and recurrent insurgencies, and this is part of rebellion. Often you see rebellion in the northern part of Mali. Migration and development aid are not two contradictory possibilities, as some external donors suggest. They have the possibility to be two complementary solutions. Combined, they would offer new prospects in new institutional environments. And their intelligent combination is all the more urgent in the context of regional crises, such as armed conflict and economic recession, which causes many migrants to return home and to seek water. Thank you for your attention, and sorry if I take more time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Isai Dognon, for this enlightening presentation. I think we are getting a very good incitement into the causes and the consequences of climate change as it concerns migration, but not only migration, but the conditions that may lead to migration and making it a problem. Actually, minimum migration will not be a problem. Even countries like Germany need migrants. They need laborers, young people who can contribute to the running of the economy. The United States at one point was like that. And many countries have the same situation, that they don't mind migration or in-migration to their countries. Now, there are causes. One of them is induced by climate change, and there are means of either preventing migration or keeping it in a workable way. And there are the consequences which have to be dealt with. So our dear speakers have covered all the topics, I think, in a very comprehensive way, and I thank them very much for that. Now, I can have two questions to start with. We still have about 19 minutes to until we finish the finishing time or anticipated time, but we can go over that for a few minutes, 10 minutes or 15 minutes. Now, if we have two questions, and please refer to which speaker or which presenter do you want to clarify the subject of the question. So shall we start? Yes, Mr. Dursun.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much for this very insightful and very informative presentations. Really, I get a lot of information from different sides of the climate change and the migration nexus. Therefore, I would like to ask, of course, I have several questions to be asked, but I will only try to ask some of them, if you permit me, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Caroline. Caroline, when we think about the climate change effect on water resources and the food security, do they take into account the migration or not? I mean, the risk of climate change is explaining something on the water resources shortage and the food security, let's say. Is this approach include the migration? I mean, let's say, not instead of migration and the environmental displacement in future. I mean, you explained that this is a complex situation, but if the climate will not so much effective on the migration, what can we think on it? What kind of approach can we develop? Then climate change will bring us much less problems in terms of displacement. Can we say so?
No, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's not that it's going to bring us necessarily less displacement or necessarily more, right? I think again, these things are really localized and dependent on the characteristics of households, of individuals, how they will individually be affected. So some places you might see more displacement and some places less, which neither one necessarily being a good thing. But in terms of water security, again, this is something that you have to look at, dynamics in terms of economics and agriculture, what the dependency there is on water, and the relationship between, I think, food security, including water security, is a strong one. So whether we're looking at that in the origin point, so for example, you having fewer water resources, fewer water, or for whether that's potable water. So for example, my work in Comoros, this is a huge issue, a lack of potable water, and that driving kind of short-term or movements similar to which can be seen in the Sahel as well. But for example, women who have to travel farther and further and farther to find water, because it's not available locally. And so that also be affecting children, meaning children are coming out of school, etc. So we might not call that even displacement, but it is completely shifting socioeconomic dynamics in these origin points. Now, of course, you can look at the Lake Chad Basin and see also what happens with decreasing water, and as populations move towards dwindling supplies, how that friction can also drive conflict between pastoralists and farmers and fishers, etc. And so you can also in that way see it as a question of destination. So what happens as more people converge around these limited resources? So food security, if we include water security there, I think is an extremely important facet. It's not just, this direct people get displaced because their house gets knocked down, right? It doesn't always work like that. And I will plug, there's an upcoming report that I'm actually working on with UN Environment on resources, including water and issues of migration and displacement.
Okay,
Yes,
okay,
thank
Caroline, thank you.
Peter Kovacs, Mr. Peter Kovacs here. Do you have something to add? I would give you the floor if you like.
Yes, thank you very much. I really want to congratulate all the speakers because they experiences to share with us. It was really amazing. And I just came into my mind related with the last presentation presented by Isai, that you have a plenty of water in Mali, according to your presentation. And the main problem is that the farmers have to pay. We have technically an opposite case in Hungary, at least. We're trying to force the farmers to pay for the water because so far they did not pay for the irrigation water. So it's a little bit confusing for me how it is look like in Africa at this moment, because we also have a strong EU policy related with pricing. So we have to, let's say, pay the necessary price for all the water utilization. And I think also that, and I can tell you that my ministry, the Ministry of Interior, is also responsible for migration issues. And it's really interesting link between the migration and also the availability of the water resources. Because it also said in the chat box that the EU also has a kind of frightening policy related with the migration, that just threatening people that, or frightening people that we will have millions of migrants coming into Europe due to the climate change. So it seems to be after those presentations that it might be not really true at this moment. And I also think that people are more likely not leaving their homeland. They move to the neighboring countries only, and they also willing to return if the conditions are improving. And I really see, or I have seen a good exemplars also. We have bilateral cooperation with Sudan, and it was very good exemplar when the Sudanese government just established deep wells for the people. They supplying, let's say, 5-6 village from a well, and they decreased the distance to get potable water, and only this measure was enough for the people to stay, not to leave their own region. So those exemplars are very interesting for me as well, although I am only a civil engineer, so I strictly a technical person. But if we just looking for also the social economic aspects of the water resource overuse or the lack of the water resources, it's really interesting. So thank you very much. I'm glad to participate in this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peter. Any of the speakers want to comment on that?
Maybe Sarah can add something. Sarah,
Where is
the
Sarah?
chairman.
Okay.
Is Sarah listening to us? Sarah?
I couldn't find her in the Sarah is did she leave? No. Okay. Until Sarah appears, I would take another question. Who has actually I'm a city planner by nature of my career, but I worked for 1 year in an irrigation establishment, which is the Jordan Valley Authority, which is responsible for the irrigation. Now, it is very delicate condition if you have less water than you anticipate, and or you have less technological means to use that water. For instance, many of the farmers were paying very little money for the water, so they were using flood irrigation, and much of the water was wasted and going back with to the fields with with pollutions. So changing the technology, it has some cost, of course, but it may also help the farmers stay on the land and their families to stay nearby, and the economy, the role of agriculture in the economy will continue as anticipated. So certain things can be resolved. Can be, for instance, they introduced in some areas of the Jordan Valley smart irrigation, where some sensors were put in the ground to sense if the plants are getting enough water or not. And accordingly, the taps will open and send water for irrigation. Of course, this is a kind of experimental at this stage, but it may work. There are other means, for instance, like drop irrigation, which is working very well also for certain parts of the Jordan Valley. But speaking of a country which is poor in water resources, this becomes a very, very important subject to handle. You may give examples from other places, other countries, and even in Turkey, the overdraft of aquifers has caused some recessions of the land in some areas in Turkey and also in Jordan. The recession of the Dead Sea because of the lack of the receiving waters also is causing this, and many agricultural land is lost for that reason. So water is life, as they say, and life has to go on if the other means can also be made available. I think this is a very important issue that will come in front of all the nations of the world in the coming 5 to 10 years. So research in this field is very important, and cooperation between research organizations or institutions is very important. And also solution-oriented research and applicable research is very important. So that needs some kind of financing, that needs a kind of organizational setups, cooperation with countries. I think much of that burden falls on our shoulders, we the people who are researchers and doing some work on this field. And I would suggest to you that if we circulate the results of this webinar to you all in a report, can you please make some additions and refinements to the text, and maybe we can have it submitted to some organizations which are working in this field. So maybe we can do something very helpful to ourselves and to our nations. What do you say about that? Caroline is smiling. She may have something to say.
I support the initiative. I won't say more because I see their hands raised, so I don't want to step on the time.
Whose hand?
Question. Yeah.
Whose hand is raised?
Professor Kibaroğlu. Professor Kibaroğlu has a very interesting question.
Turkish don't eat, by the way.
Turkish?
No,
Professor
because
Kibaroğlu.
Jamal Bey from UMT will answer.
Ayşegül Hanım.
Tamam.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for this great panel.
Oh, they are expecting from us.
Yeah, I think Yasmin Al-Hayek's microphone is on and we are here.
Yeah. Will you please, Yasmin? Will you please unmute? Mute yourself.
Maybe it's okay now.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks a lot to the presenters all. It's great to hear really scientific and sensible research. My question is over there. I mean, it's a very general one, I know, but I would like to see some change really, because there is such great research in Europe, and from elsewhere, attracting the attention of politicians and policymakers to change their policies. But I really want to hear some insights, whether there will be change in the European politics regarding the migrants. Because what Commission says or what Commission supports through the research projects, we cannot see it in, they are really reflected in the politics and policy towards the migrants. Yeah, this is a general question to, could be Camille or Caroline, who would like to take our comment. I don't know, just a general one.
Who has something to add on this point?
Sure, I'm happy to start in, and I think Caroline probably has a lot to add. Maybe a general point on, I mean 2 points on this. I think on the one hand, there is a realization, I think, at Commission level from the development harm of the Commission, the impact of, I think, some of this dynamic. And some of it they've tried to address in the past. I think, you know, after 2015-16, there was this EU Trust Fund for Africa that was created. Some of the action under that trust fund were aimed at mitigate some of the effect of climate change on vulnerable population. This has been very limited, but I think as we're now moving to a next funding phase at the Commission, this is also a time to have this conversation. I think there is some goodwill in some part of the Commission, but there also are other parts that maybe have some slightly different view. And so as negotiations are going on, and it's also a question of the Commission interacting with member state on that, which leads me to a second point on I think climate migrants are not so high on the agenda in general. And I don't know if Caroline, you would agree, but there's a lot of talk about indeed this fear that more people are going to come. I think climate is one of the factor that is being used to kind of weaponize this fear of mass migration to Europe. But at the moment, I think there's been more priority in terms of tackling immediate arrival. And I think we have all this issue related to what happened when people get to Europe and there are no adequate, you know, reception condition for people, that people cannot claim asylum, that there is this pushback. So I think it also leads to a broader question on where we are with the common European migration and asylum policy, and all the divides that have been, you know, that have happened in the past 5-6 years. I mean, that are older than that, but have definitely paralyzed the conversation in the past few years.
Yes.
Maybe Caroline will add something. Huh? Caroline.
Yeah,
it's a very good question.
Yes, it's an excellent question, which has many long responses I could choose, but to try to be short, you know, I think that the Commission, it's hard to talk about Commission as some sort of kind of single entity, because what we see with climate migration is a lot of time there's a lot more appetite for this discussion within like DG Klima and environment, and in general in international processes, more in the UNFCCC. There's more discussion around climate and migration being kind of the poster child of a human impact, than there is necessarily in like the migration discussions, which is problematic because this is obviously connected and you can't have these being siloed. You know, the Global Compact for Migration, you see a little bit of progress, but you know, the Commission has, for example, funded the project that I mentioned in the sidebox, which is the biggest project it's ever funded on migration, is on climate and migration. So that shows, at least from the research side, some sort of appetite for knowledge. We hope that that, of course, will inform and is asked to inform the European Pact on migration and asylum. So we hope that that leads to more evidence-based policy and more solutions that are not fear-based and are not about a very kind of simple Europe capacity to host migrants. But that remains to be seen. So we're seeing shifts kind of every year. Even only in the last year, the European Parliament changed quite significantly its language and discussion on climate and migration for, in my opinion, the better. So obviously one remains hopeful, but it's not always so clear cut.
Yeah.